Steve Gonsalves stated that the means of death between the victims did not match. Kathy Mabbitt, the coroner in the Idaho 4 case, is quoted by Steve Gonsalves as stating, "Sir, I don't think that stabs is the right word. This was a strong weapon, not like a stab." Now, does this sound like she's describing a knife? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk about why the idea that multiple weapons were used to carry out the Idaho 4 crimes has not been addressed by law enforcement. Now, more weapons would mean more perpetrators, likely. It doesn't, really seem as though one individual would be carrying a sharp-edged weapon in each hand. That wouldn't leave them a free hand, to manipulate their victims or to even use a handrail or a doorknob. So it seems unlikely that somebody would be walking around with a sharp-edged weapon in each hand. Steve Gonsalves said in an interview right after the crimes occurred, "I'll cut to the chase. Their means of death don't match." Now, when I saw this interview, it felt like he really needed to get that out. And I felt like maybe he was telling us that there were multiple perpetrators. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly what he was saying, but when I heard that in this interview, to me, it was an indication that there were multiple weapons, which would make it likely that there were multiple perpetrators. When he's asked by the interviewer to confirm that he's talking about Kaylee and Maddie's injuries not matching, he simply states, "They don't match." He goes on to say that their points of damage do not match. He says, "I'm just gonna say it." Now, does this sound like he's talking about two victims who were attacked with the same weapon? Steve Gonsalves also says in another interview that a detective told him that this was a weapon that someone spent some money on, something that they were proud of. He describes it as a brutal weapon. Now, we know that these students, they liked their knives enough to take photographs with them. But I just don't feel like a K-bar knife would be somebody's prized possession. It's a good, sturdy knife, and there's a lot of things that you can do with a K-bar. But it's not very expensive, and it's definitely not very flashy. So why would the coroner say that she wouldn't describe the wounds as stabs, but then come out and say that all of the victims were stabbed in their beds? Why would Kathy Mabbitt say, "I don't believe that stabs is the right word. They were more like gouges and tears," but then say that the victims were all stabbed? Gouges and tears would be a good indication that this sharp-edged weapon was heavier than a knife. Something that could be swung, maybe. Do I believe that a knife could have been used? I think that a knife was used in addition to other weapons or another weapon. Now, I've seen people say in the comments that they believe that the reason that these wounds were different is because this attacker was exhausted. And that's a very good point, because I do think that this attacker would be exhausted if they were acting alone. But how does the same weapon create different wounds? Now, law enforcement believes that this perpetrator began on the top level, which would mean that Maddie and Kaylee were the first two victims. If the attacker was that exhausted after the first two victims, why wouldn't he just go down the stairs, walk to the left real quick, and exit out of that back sliding glass door, rather than walk across the living room to Xana's bedroom and take on Ethan and Xana? Ethan was a strong young man, and Xana was a fighter. So if this perpetrator began on the top level, it would seem as though that was his point of interest. That was the focus. So if he was exhausted, why not just exit the house after he takes the life of the two victims on the top level? The wounds are described as different from one victim to the other. Now, if these wounds were from a firearm, let's say, and the wounds were different, they didn't match, that would indicate that two different calibers of rounds were used, which would mean that two separate firearms were used. So investigators would be looking for two different firearms. Now, why is it in this case the wounds are being described as different? They don't match, but somehow they were created by the same weapon. That just doesn't make sense. A puncture is described in the medical dictionary as a wound that's caused by a pointed blade or object, such as a nail or a knife or even a sharp tooth. A gouge is described as, digging or cutting into in a rough and violent manner. Now, these wounds were described as gouges and tears. Skin tears are defined as wounds that are created by blunt force or friction. So how did one K-bar knife create all of these different types of wounds? Now, it would make total sense if the wounds were described as punctures and slices, because those could definitely be made with the same weapon. But to describe the wounds as gouges and tears, those are totally different wounds than a slice or a puncture. Is it possible that one K-bar knife was used to carry out the Idaho 4 crimes? Is it possible that one knife took the lives of 4 separate individuals? I'm sure it is, in the right hands. But in my opinion, different wounds would indicate different weapons. One weapon would not be able to create a variety of different types of wounds. So in my opinion, since there were different types of wounds, that would indicate that there were different weapons. Now, this would also indicate, in my opinion, that this would mean multiple perpetrators. As I said, I don't see one individual walking into a house holding a sharp-edged weapon in each hand. What are they going to do if they need to open a door or set their hand down? They're either going to have to drop that weapon or put it under their arm and hold it. I just don't see one individual carrying 2 sharp-edged weapons. When I saw that interview that Steve and Christy Gonsalves did right after the crimes were committed, and he stated that the wounds did not match, or their means of death did not match, in my opinion, it was important for him to put that information out there. And the way that I understood that was that the wounds didn't match, which would mean that it was very possible that there were multiple weapons, which would also mean that there were multiple attackers. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.